Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for coming to this talk on women in folklore. And before we get started, I want to thank a few people. First of all, I want to thank my mom. She was born in Czechoslovakia, which is now Slovakia, a small country in Eastern Europe, a poor country made up mostly of peasants who didn't have formal educations, didn't have a lot of power, didn't have a lot of money, but who had very rich cultural lives, and that was thanks to folklore. Here's a picture of my mom, my grandmom, my uncle, and my great-grandmother. And this is the countryside that my mom grew up in. Slovakia is a very beautiful country. And this is a house very similar to the house that my mom was born in. It was a house built by hand by my grandfather. And as you can see, there are storks nesting on the roof. And here's an ox cart. My mother told me that she remembered riding on the ox cart when she left Slovakia to immigrate to America as a child. And here's a picture of a village in Slovakia, very similar to the village my mother grew up in. And you see the stara babka, the old grandmothers, in the lower left-hand corner with the babushkas and the aprons, very similar to what I encountered when I traveled to Slovakia in the 1970s. And here you can see some Slovak workers doing really hard agricultural labor by hand with relatively primitive tools. And you can see more Slovaks working hard, but as you can see, they're wearing these gorgeous, probably sheepskin vests that have been embroidered by hand, and that's part of their folk culture. And here we see a group of kids, and as you can see, they're quite skinny. Some of them don't have shoes, but they still have these gorgeous folk costumes, probably embroidered. And here on the left, we see a man playing a fujara, which is a 6-foot-long shepherd's flute. The music of a fujara is incredibly beautiful. In the center, we see a man doing the Janošík dance. And on the right, we see makoviec or makovi kolač. It's a very delicious pastry made from ground poppy seeds. So my deep love of folklore I inherited from my mother, who was lucky enough to grow up in a very rich folk culture. I also want to thank Alan Dundes. Alan Dundes has been called, and this line is from his obituary, the most prolific and influential folklorist of his generation, and many would say of all time. Alan Dundes was my professor at the University of California at Berkeley, and I want to praise him for 3 things. Number one, he had a massive intellect. He knew everything there was to know about folklore. He used to hold office hours communally so that you would be in his office when other students would be in his office. Students approached him with question after question. I never saw anyone approach him with a question that he could not answer with quotes, citations, articles to read, books to look up, people to contact. I also want to praise him for his incredible courage. Folklore is very controversial, as you are going to see if you watch this entire presentation. And there are many things in this presentation that I frankly am afraid to say. But Alan Dundes was never afraid. He said things that upset people, that frightened people, that angered people, but he didn't stop. He plowed ahead, brave man that he is. And I also want to praise him for encouraging his fellow professionals, from his graduate students to the scholars around him, to follow their own muse. He never pressured me to be the kind of folklorist that he was. He pressured me to be the kind of folklorist that I dreamed of being. And I also want to thank Arlene Scala, head of the Women's Studies Department at William Patterson University, who asked me to give this talk. Arlene is just a beautiful, wonderful, blessed human being, and it's been a real blessing for me to have Arlene in my life. Okay, so if we're talking about women in folklore, one of the things that we have to do is define folklore. What is folklore? It's really hard to define. It is really hard to define. This definition, which I got from the internet, is as good as any. Folklore is the traditional beliefs, customs, and stories of a community passed through the generations by word of mouth. And in this talk, I'm going to focus on myths, legends, folktales, joke, rituals, material culture, and songs. Myths are narratives, that is, stories, about the time before time began. The main characters of myths are gods, and what gods do in myths is create the world. Legends are narratives, that is, stories, about real time, the time that you and I inhabit. And the main characters in legends are human beings just like you and me. And generally, legends concern exceptional behavior. And for an example of a myth, we know the Genesis story, God creating the world in 7 days and creating Adam and Eve. An example of a legend would be the Trojan War. The Greeks go off to do battle in Troy. Folk tales occur once upon a time. It's not a real time. And they include magical behavior and talking animals and wish fulfillment. Jokes are stories we tell to get a laugh. Rituals are traditional behaviors that we engage in time out of time. You know, every year on December 25th, it's Christmas, so that's time out of time. Material culture are things you can touch, like wooden spoons or embroidered clothing, and songs. When people hear the word folklore, they generally have this idea that they're about to be exposed to something quaint and wholesome and innocent and multicultural and edifying, that you can bring the kids to. But in reality, folklore can be pretty darn scary, upsetting, horrifying, obscene. And in fact, there's a lot of material in this talk that might upset and offend some people. As a matter of fact, some people are so upset by folklore that they actually send death threats. And Alan Dundes has received death threats for his folklore publication. Because folklore is not nice, and folklore is not politically correct. I'll give you an example. Here's a joke. What's the useless meat around a vagina called? Let me ask that again. What's the useless meat around a vagina called? Answer, a woman. That's a joke. It's incredibly misogynist, but it's a joke. Here's another joke. How do you know when a Polish girl has her period? She's wearing one sock. That's a joke. It's folklore. It's offensive, but it's folklore. Here's another kind of potentially upsetting item of folklore. This is the Falcon's Daughter, which was collected by Hassan el-Shami in Egypt. It's a story that is so rife with misogyny, it kind of boggles your mind. It starts with misogyny. A man gives birth to a daughter, and even before the daughter is born, his wife says to him, if it's a son, bring it home. If it's a girl, leave her out in the street. In other words, female infanticide, which is something that comes up a lot in folklore, and that is killing females at birth. So this man gets pregnant, and his wife says, if it's a boy, we'll keep it. If it's a girl, get rid of it. So the guy gives birth to a girl and just leaves it out in the street. And a falcon comes along and adopts the girl, thus the title of the folk tale, The Falcon's Daughter. And the Sultan's son falls in love with this falcon's daughter who's living up in a tree. And he takes her home, he takes the falcon's daughter home, and his mother starts torturing the girl. So in other words, this is about mother-in-law, daughter-in-law conflict. And the mother starts chopping the girl up. First she chops off her arm, then she chops off her other arm, then she chops off her legs until there's nothing left but a lump of flesh, which the mother-in-law throws out the window. And the mother-in-law then takes the daughter's face and puts it on her own head. And the mother-in-law seduces her own son and gets pregnant by him. So this is all very grotesque. And then the son is wandering around in the street, and this lump of flesh, who has somehow magically been restored to the falcon's daughter, says to him, you know, you just impregnated your own mother. You've been having sex with your mother, and I'm your real wife. And then, as if it was not horrifying enough so far, the husband goes home and pours gasoline on his pregnant mother and burns her to death. And that's the folktale. So you tell me if folklore is not occasionally quite misogynistic and quite upsetting. Here's another example. This is an Inuit tale, and we sometimes refer to the Inuit as Eskimos. A daughter is sick of taking care of her old elderly mother. And so when the old elderly mother asks for a drink of water, the daughter hands her a glass of her own urine. And the mother drinks the urine and then says to the daughter, would you rather have sex with a louse or a scorpion? And the daughter says, a scorpion. And the mother pulls a scorpion out of her daughter's vagina, and she pulls one after another out of her daughter's vagina until the daughter dies. It's pretty awful. It's pretty shocking. Bengt Holbeck, a great folklorist, said that folktales resolve tensions between the young and the old, the male and the female, the rich and the poor. And in this particular Eskimo folktale, the resolution is for the mother to kill her own daughter. So in folklore, you get the good, the bad, and the ugly. Why? Because folklore is a human creation. And people all over the world were all human. And we all have the same minds, and we all have the same hearts. And everything in our minds and in our hearts is reflected in folklore, including the 7 deadly sins: greed, sloth, envy, lust, gluttony, wrath, pride. It's all in there. One of the oldest stories we know, the story of Cain and Abel, is about one brother killing another brother. So, folklore doesn't really provide an escape from the human mind or the human heart. Folklore has some logic. I mean, in real life, obviously, old women who are being mistreated by their daughters generally don't pull scorpions out of their daughters' vaginas. Like that doesn't really happen in real life. Folklore is like dreams. It breaks rules of decency and logic. The logic of folklore is the logic of dreams. Now, folklore is powerful. And totalitarians, that is, people who want to control human behavior, try to manipulate folklore, because by manipulating folklore, you can manipulate people. And people especially, totalitarians especially, want to manipulate folklore that involves women, because women, of course, are the ones who give birth and raise children. And so the idea is, if you can control women, you can control the next generation. And totalitarians have had like a couple of tools, and one is folklore, which is material that is just completely invented out of thin air, and it pretends to be folklore. And another tool is folklorism. And folklorism is when you take a little tiny bit of folklore and you create a product, like a product that you want people to buy or to believe in. And believe it or not, the Nazis were very big on folklore. As a matter of fact, the Nazis pointed to folklore as part of their inspiration. And I'm sure everyone is familiar with Little Red Riding Hood, the tale about the girl in the red hood who goes out into the forest and is confronted by a wolf. Well, in the Nazi version, Adolf Hitler saved Little Red Riding Hood, and Snow White's father wanted to invade Poland. And of course, invading Poland was how the Nazis began World War II in Europe. And other regimes, including communist Chinese, made use of folklore. And what you see on the right there is a traditional Chinese art form, that is a wood block print, that was created by the communist Chinese to encourage women to have only one child. So this is what we'd call folklorism. There's like an element of folklore in it, but it's been cooked up by a central office to manipulate the minds of the public. Now, a lot of people really get down on Walt Disney movies that involve folklore, especially the ones made in the 30s, 40s, 50s, because they say, oh, the heroines are so passive and it's not, quote, real folklore. Well, here's the thing. Cinderella is truly a folktale. It's a real folktale. And there are versions of Cinderella where she's pretty and passive. So we really can't say that Disney is not telling the real version of Cinderella, because he used a version that fit his own worldview. Disney himself wanted a pretty and passive Cinderella, and that's what he got. And he used the folk tales that depicted a pretty and passive Cinderella. There are other versions of Cinderella in which Cinderella is quite violent. There are versions of Cinderella in which she kills her stepmother. In one version, she invites her stepmother to look for something in a hope chest, and Cinderella comes up and slams down the lid of the hope chest on the stepmother, just thus chopping off her head. So there are some nice Cinderellas and there are some more violent Cinderellas, and Disney picked the nice Cinderella. And here, of course, is Disney's Snow White and Disney's Sleeping Beauty. And the features in Disney movies that feminists have complained about also appear in folklore. So you really can't blame Disney and you can't blame men for producing folklore in which women are supposed to be beautiful, young, passive, silent, arm candy for heroic men, and how they produce heirs. Because women themselves tell these stories. There's lots of wicked old spinsters in folklore. Independent women are often depicted as either dangerous or in danger in folklore. There's a lot of ethnic stereotyping in folklore, so you blame Disney, but guess what? For hundreds of years, all over the world, people have been telling folk tales with ethnic stereotypes in them, and that includes tellers of every ethnic group. In other words, every ethnic group on Earth is busy stereotyping their next door neighbors. Women fight other women in folklore. I mean, go back to the Old Testament and you've got Rachel and Leah competing for the love of a man. So you can find the material that you want in folklore. You can find women cooperating with each other. You can find spunky heroines, but you really have to look for it. In some more recent movies, Disney has tried to pump out, or Disney Studios, because of course Walt is no longer with us, but Disney Studios have tried to pump out like these more spunky, intellectual, ethnically diverse, woman warrior type heroines. And a lot of this is just folklorism, or it's fake lore. It's something that somebody in a studio made up out of whole cloth. It's not part of any tradition at all, because they knew that the market wanted this particular kind of heroine. So this is like the commercial version of folklore. It's like folklorism. There's other groups who invent folklore out of whole cloth and claim that it's like centuries old folklore. And I personally don't have anything against neo-pagans. I know some neo-pagans who are really nice people, and I've been to their ceremonies. But they do invent material and pass it off as ancient traditions that are thousands of years old. So you really have to be cautious. There are a lot of websites that say, "Oh, we're the 1,000-year-old goddess worshiping church." Well, yeah, you know what? You're not really. You just made this stuff up. One of the things that the neo-pagans make up is this idea that thousands of years ago, during the Stone Age, all over the earth, everybody worshipped a mother goddess, and it was a great time, and everybody was having orgies, and everybody was equal, and we loved nature, and we lived in harmony with nature, and women were respected, and this is all nonsense. Well, I shouldn't say it's nonsense. It's like people's ideal, but this history, it never happened. There was really never a period when all over the earth everybody worshiped the goddess and everybody was living in harmony. And, sorry. No. Scholarship has shown that these goddess religions were invented relatively recently by a couple of eccentric romantic people, largely in England. And there's a couple of good books on this topic. If you're interested, read Cynthia Eller, The Myth of Matriarchal Prehistory, Why an Invented Past Won't Give Women a Future, and Goddess Unmasked by Philip G. Davis. One of the arguments of the neo-pagans is that if we lived in a culture where everybody worshipped goddesses, then women would be treated much better. So let's look at India. In Hinduism, there are many goddesses worshipped, as I know because I lived in the Indian subcontinent. And here we have Durga, and here we have Saraswati, and here we have Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth. And these images were put together by an advertising firm in Bombay. And this was their goal, to show that even in a country where goddesses are worshipped, women can be treated abysmally badly. And if you look at the close-up of the faces of the women in these goddess images, they have been battered. And so the point of these ads from the ad campaign from Bombay, India, is to protest against the mistreatment of women in India. And I guess it was in 2018, Thomas Reuters Foundation put out a list of dangerous countries in the world for women, and India was one of the leading countries as being a dangerous country for women because so many women are battered, so many female fetuses are aborted, so many women do not have an education, do not have rights, are forced into marriage, are trafficked sexually. And the point here is that even in goddess worshiping cultures, women face challenges. And here's the child goddess in Kathmandu, Nepal. And these girls are selected to be worshipped as a goddess. And you would think, oh boy, lucky thing, you get to be a goddess. Well, the people whose children have been used as goddesses complain that these girls are not educated, they're not allowed to see their families, they don't have normal lives, and as soon as they menstruate, they become human again, and they're demoted, and they have to go back and re-enter normal life. And I went to one of the goddess worshiping ceremonies in Kathmandu in the 1980s. I was surrounded by thousands of men. It was only men, ironically enough. And one of the men grabbed me and I literally had to fight him off. It was a very scary and upsetting experience. Another aspect of women's folklore around which there's a lot of made-up stuff is pretty much anything that neo-pagans claim about witches. Number one, it's invented. It was invented relatively recently. And number two, it's not true. Here's a documentary called The Burning Times, which was funded by the government of Canada, and it's completely inaccurate. And here's a book by Barbara Ehrenreich, a very respected author, which is Midwives and Nurses, also just not true. And here I list things that people believe are true about the witches and the witch trials, and I've crossed out the parts that aren't true. In the Middle Ages, nope, didn't happen in the Middle Ages. The Catholic Church, nope, it was usually civil authorities. And the Catholic Inquisition, nope, believe it or not, the Inquisition actually stopped witch burning in Spain, murdered 9 million women. Nope, they say that they made up that number in order to top the Holocaust. Because the church hated women so much. No, that was not the cause of the witch trials. These women were the community's healers. No, they weren't. And remnants of the ancient goddess worshipping religion. No, they weren't. And modern science and secularism ended the witch trials. No, they didn't. And if you're interested in this and you want more details, check out this YouTube video called The Witch Craze, Fact and Fiction. Another myth that people have about folklore is that modern people are all screwed up, and if we go back to the time of the noble savage, everything will be great, and there's no war, and the noble savage is very wise, and they never got sick, and they had cures for everything, and everything was equal, and they preserved the earth. And that's not true. If we look at primitive societies that existed until relatively recent times, we find that the status of women in these societies is often quite tragic. The Yanomami and the Munduruku are two sometimes called Stone Age tribes, and of course that term is controversial, in the Amazon River Basin, and one of the ways that women are kept in line is through the threat of gang rape. That if a woman breaks the rules of the tribe, she's gang raped. And breaking the rules of the tribe can include being, quote, too sexy, unquote. And the Australian Aborigines, who lived in the Australian subcontinent for something like 70,000 years, when they first made contact with Europeans, there were 100 women for every 150 men. How did that happen? Partly through female infanticide, through destroying female babies. And there are lots of folklore customs in other cultures that modern women would find unappealing. Well, I shouldn't say modern, that women who are not part of those cultures would find unappealing. For example, female genital mutilation, for example, sati, in which widows burned themselves alive on their husband's funeral pyres. And when I lived in Nepal, and these are a few pictures of Nepal, I was told not to sleep inside the house when I was menstruating because women's blood is polluting, and women's blood is so powerfully polluting that you can really cause disaster just by allowing your blood to come into contact with anything. I was even told that when a young girl menstruates for the first time, she should not look at the sun because she would pollute the sun. And so women are forced in some villages in Nepal to sleep outside of the house when they're menstruating. And these women sometimes die in these huts because they're not well ventilated, or because the women freeze to death, or they burn up in fires. And these are two menstrual hut deaths that occurred early in 2019 in Nepal. And I also lived in the Central African Republic, and in the Central African Republic I was told that men will not do laundry for women, and this became an issue because while we were being trained, we had like no free time to do our own clothes, so men were hired to wash our clothing, but they would not wash women's underwear because women's underwear might have come in contact with women's blood, and women's blood is powerful and evil. And you know, that's an idea found in Africa and Asia. Another problem with folklore is that folklore is dirty. And what do I mean by dirty? Well, there's a lot of poop in folklore. Here's an Iraqi tale from Iraq in the Middle East. There's conflict again between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, and that's a typical conflict found in tales revolving around women. Either it's a stepmother who's bashing on the stepdaughter, or it's a mother-in-law who's bashing her daughter-in-law, because in these traditional cultures, once a woman gets some power, she often uses it to crush younger women. And so in this particular tale, a mother-in-law poops in her daughter-in-law's bed and goes and tells her son, And the son, who's kind of figuring out what's going on, comes up to the mother with some gold coins in his hand and says, "Look, the poop turned to gold." And the mother says, "Oh, it wasn't the daughter who pooped in the bed, it was actually me." And the son thereby, exposes the mother-in-law for being manipulative and cruel, and he kicks her out of the house. And there's also a lot of pee in folklore. Here's Danae being raped by Zeus in the form of a shower of gold coins, which is a Greek myth. And it has inspired many artworks in the modern era. And nasty stuff also sometimes comes out of the mouth in folklore. In Diamonds and Toads, which is a European folktale, a girl is cruel to an older woman. Again, we have this conflict between youth and age. And a young girl is unkind to an older woman, and she is cursed such that when she opens her mouth, nasty things like frogs and snakes come out of her mouth. And in one version of the tale, the nasty things come out of her butt rather than her mouth. Every time she takes a step, either a snake or a frog or a lizard or what have you falls out of her butt. And I'm sorry, I'm not very good at Photoshop, so this doesn't really look like a lizard coming out of a woman's butt. A friend said that this looked like a Geico commercial. And there's also a fair amount of semen in folklore. This is Khepri, an Egyptian god. He is represented by scarab beetles. Why is he represented by scarab beetles? Because the ancients believed that these scarab beetles that spend their time pushing round balls of poop around the countryside were all male, and that these male scarab beetles would inject their semen into this round ball of poop and thereby reproduce. And so Khepri is this Egyptian god who creates the world by masturbating and then by taking his semen and swallowing it and thereby getting pregnant. And again, like the goddess people say, well, women can give birth and societies that worship goddesses honor this. Yeah, I don't think so. In ancient Egypt, they did worship goddesses, but Khepri creates the world by swallowing his own semen. He doesn't need a woman any more than that scarab beetle does. And by the way, there are female scarab beetles, and the ancients were completely wrong. And another reason that the scarab beetle is sacred is because the ancient Egyptians associated those round balls of poop with the sun. And of course, the sun is sacred because it causes plants to grow. And here's another story that's full of semen. On the left, you see Horus, the falcon-headed god. In the middle, you see Isis. And over on the right, you see Set. And Set is the troublemaker. He's always causing problems. And Set is competing with Horus for primacy. Set wants to be on top. And so he uses Horus's hand to achieve an erection and to ejaculate. And so Set's semen ends up in Horus's hand. And so Horus goes and complains to his mommy, who is Isis, and says, "Oh, mommy, that bad Set," and Set, by the way, is Isis's brother and Horus's uncle. "So nasty Uncle Set jerked himself off with my hand, and now my hand is full of his semen." And so Isis did what any good mother would do. She chopped off Horus's hand and threw it away. And then she masturbated her son. I mean, what mother would not do this for her son? And she masturbated her son, and she took Horus's semen and smeared it on some lettuce. And Set ate the lettuce, thereby swallowing the semen. And once the gods found out that Set had swallowed Horus's semen, Set was diminished in stature. And what we learned from this is that even, 4,000 years ago in ancient Egypt, the one who receives semen is lower in stature. So even though the ancient Egyptians worshipped some goddesses, they still perceived women as being lower in stature than men because the women are the ones who receive male semen into their bodies. And there's also a lot of breast milk in folklore. Here you see Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome, being suckled by a she-wolf. And believe it or not, we return the favor. There are women who suckle puppies. And as a matter of fact, Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and she was also the mother of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, died after childbirth. And in an attempt to relieve her symptoms after the difficult childbirth, doctors instructed her to suckle puppies. But unfortunately, the puppies were unable to save her life. And this scholarly article argues that women suckling puppies may have contributed to the domestication of wolves into dogs. And I have no idea if that's true. And there's also a lot of menstrual blood in folklore. Some people argue that Little Red Riding Hood is in fact a tale about women coming of age, coming into their sexual maturity. And the wolf, of course, is male sexuality, which is scary and threatening to the female. And there's also a lot of just regular old blood in folklore. I love this painting because it is so subtle. You look at it initially and you say, wow, that woman's proud. Wow, that woman's noble. But there's something a little bit off about it because she's just got this look on her face. And why is she holding back the curtain? Like, what's behind her? And then you notice that she's leaning on an axe. And then you notice that trickling from the axe is a trickle of blood. This is Clytemnestra, and she has just chopped up her husband Agamemnon to avenge him for murdering their daughter Iphigenia. Now, why did Agamemnon murder his daughter Iphigenia? It was to placate a god? No, a goddess. Diana, aka Artemis, was only satisfied by the death of a girl. So there you go with the idea that goddesses are friendly to women. And here you have an artist's rendition. You see Diana floating on a cloud. As you can see, she's hugging her sacred deer, and she's got the crescent moon in her hair. And you see Agamemnon preparing the sacrificial fire. And there's Iphigenia. Looks like she's going to burn for a long time because she's quite a hefty gal. And she has a mask on because she's about to be sacrificed to the gods. And over on the right, you see a more kind of graphic illustration of Clytemnestra. She's just covered with blood. And here's another version, which I just think is wonderful, of Clytemnestra murdering her husband. And here we see a lovely scene of a mother hugging her kids. But that mother is Medea, and she's about to kill those kids because she's pissed off at her husband, Jason. And more blood in folklore. Here we have the Maenads, who are a bunch of women who worship Dionysus, and they are about to use their bare hands to rip the body of Orpheus to shreds. So it doesn't get gorier than that. And here you can see poor Orpheus's head in the sand. And here's one of the Maenads gazing at Orpheus's decapitated head. And why did the Maenads kill Orpheus? Because he wanted to worship only one god. And the Maenads punished him for that by ripping his body to shreds. There's also a fair amount of self-mutilation in folklore. We all know that in Cinderella, the goal was to fit into those glass slippers. And Cinderella's wicked stepsister chopped up her own feet so that she could fit into the glass slippers. She chopped off her heel and her toes. And sadly, other people chop off people's body parts. We already heard in the tale of the Falcon's daughter how the mother-in-law chopped up her daughter-in-law's body. Well, in this story, the story of the maiden with no hands, it's a European tale. A father chops off his daughter's hands because he wants to have sex with her and she doesn't want to have sex with him. There's also a fair amount of incest in folklore. Here we see Phaedra. She's panting with desire for her stepson Hippolytus. And here we see dead Jocasta, who married her son Orpheus, who had to blind himself because he committed this terrible sin of marrying his own mother. And in Native American tales, there is a trickster figure named Coyote. And Morris Opler studied the Athabascan Indians in the American Southwest. And in some of the tribes, not all of the tribes, but in some of the tribes, there's a taboo that says that sons cannot have contact with their mother-in-law. Son-in-laws cannot have contact with their mother-in-law. And in those tribes, Coyote has sex with his mother-in-law. So in other words, Coyote's job is to break the rules. In the tribes where the son-in-laws and mother-in-laws can have contact, there are no tales about Coyote having sex with his mother-in-law. Now here's a story that modern neo-pagans have tried to adopt and turn into a romance, and a modern romance, which I think is kind of ridiculous, because the story of Isis and Osiris, let me tell you the Egyptian version, and you can tell me if this is really romantic. Set, who again is always causing trouble, chops up Osiris's body into 14 pieces and scatters them around. And Isis, who is the sister of Osiris and Set, they're all members of the same family, she goes searching around for all the body parts, and she finds all of the body parts except Osiris's penis. And she makes a penis for him and kind of reassembles his dead body and adds this kind of handmade penis to his dead body, and then takes on the form, Isis takes on the form of a kite and hovers over her brother's corpse, until the penis is erect. And then she has sex with him while her siblings are looking on. So if that's romantic to you, hey man, who am I to judge? And here's another image of Isis as a bird bringing her dead brother to an erection. And here's one more. And you'll often see Osiris depicted in green, and that's because he's dead. So you've got necrophilia, incest, bestiality, and voyeurism in this one tale. And for bestiality, you can't beat Leda and the swan. It's an ancient Greek story. Zeus takes on the form of a swan and impregnates Leda, and thereby brings about just a whole bunch of history. Now, folklore is the product of a community. Everybody in the community pretty much knows what the tale is going to be about. They've heard this story before. They've maybe heard it 100 times before. They might know everybody else in their group. So here you have a bunch of people in Central Asia. They're hearing their Central Asian myth. They've heard it before. Here's a bunch of peasants in Europe, and they're hearing a favorite folktale. And here's some Boy Scouts, and they're hearing a scary legend. And here's some folks in West Africa and some sailors, and they're singing a sea chanty that they've sung 100 times before. And here are some barge haulers on the Volga River, and they're going to sing one of the most famous folk songs of all time. Oh, 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 oh. And here we have an Irish spinner, and she's going to sing her Irish spinning song. So in other words, because folklore belongs to a community and it belongs in a community, people who are not in the community, people who are not part of the community, might not get it. And here's a story. Seal and her younger brother lived there. We know what each individual word means, but we don't understand this story at all. It's about a woman who, when she urinates, sounds like a man urinating. And no one knows how to interpret this story. It's been studied by serious scholars, and they each offer their own interpretation. But because we are not Clackamas Chinook, this is a story from the Clackamas Chinook, a Native American tribe from the Northwest, we can't really penetrate this story. And sometimes we don't want to because other people's folklore can be really repetitive. Let me just read you a little bit of this Hawaiian myth. Born was the coral, born was the grub, born was the earthworm, born was the starfish, born was the sea cucumber, born was the sea urchin, born was the short-spined sea urchin, born was the smooth sea urchin, born was the ring-shaped sea urchin, born was the barnacle. Do you really want to hear the rest of that? That could go on all night, like literally all night. And then there are stories that, forgive me for being politically incorrect, are just simply boring. This is an Australian creation story. Here's another image from the same rock painting. In one Australian creation story, what you've got is a brother with a huge penis and two sisters with huge clitorises. And what they do is they walk around the countryside drawing lines in the dirt with their huge sexual organs. And that's the entire story. So for people who are not part of that culture, we're not going to care about that story. And sometimes the aesthetics of other people's folklore can be off-putting. This, believe it or not, is Sita, a beautiful woman in a Southeast Asian shadow play, the star of the Ramayana. It's strange for us. And if you go to a shadow play, this is all you see, shadow puppets on a screen. And this shadow play could go on all night. So if you're a stranger to the culture, it's going to be a little bit odd. I'm going to argue that there are three ancient cultures that produced folklore that is still gripping today. And one of them is the culture of the ancient Jews. In North American folklore, especially among the Penobscot Indians, women embody an idea, corn mother, corn woman. Her body is corn. We eat corn. It's nourishing. But that's not an individual real woman. In Buddhism, in East Asia, Kuan Yin embodies compassion. It's the woman's body representing an idea. But it's not a real individual named woman. In ancient Greece, you had Athena, who embodied war and wisdom. But she's not a real woman. In the Bible, you have real, named women, average people living average lives. We know the name of women who were nothing more than agricultural workers, women who were prostitutes, women who had serious diseases, an old woman who was a widow who spent her days basically hanging out in the synagogue. We know her name. This is remarkable. I don't know of any other culture where we can name average real women from 4,000 years ago. I just don't. And that's why I think the Bible is just one of the most remarkable compilations of folklore from the ancient world. We have in the upper corner there Mary Magdalene, who was seriously ill. The Bible says that Jesus had to exorcise her. So she had some kind of serious illness. But she became the apostle to the apostles. And you see a woman here preaching to men. That is remarkable. There are so many taboos against women speaking in so many cultures. And here she is preaching to men. Then you have Ruth and Naomi. These are just two average women, agricultural, women who worked on farms. They worked in the field gathering grain. And there was a famine, and they said to each other, we're going to stick together through thick and thin. Remarkable. Then you have the woman at the well. She's from a despised ethnic group. She's a Samaritan woman. Jesus' longest conversation he has with her, with a woman. And by the way, she was a woman who slept with a lot of men to whom she was not married. And Jesus and her have a very serious theological conversation. In the lower corner, we have Anna, who is an elderly widow who hung out in the synagogue, and she's a seer. She has the ability to see the future. We have Hagar, who is a slave, who is raped by her boss. And we know about her, and we care about her. We have the woman taken in adultery, Jesus refuses to stone her. Jesus takes a stand against stoning, and Christians don't stone people after this. We have the woman who has a hemorrhage who touches Jesus' garment. We've already mentioned how women bleeding makes them impure. This woman is bleeding, and she touches not just a man, but a sacred man. This is amazing. This is liberatory. And then we have Deborah, who was one of the judges in Israel. And then there are a lot of action heroines in the Bible. We've got Judith, who on her own gumption, her own volition, sneaks her way into the enemy camp and decapitates Holofernes. And this is like a very popular theme for artists. So we've got quite a few images of Judith decapitating Holofernes. And then there's Yael or Jael. Yael was not Jewish, and believe it or not, a lot of the heroines in the Old Testament, I shouldn't say a lot, but a fair number, were not Jewish. And that's remarkable too, because usually folklore celebrates us, our in-group. And yet Jews are able to celebrate people who are not Jewish as well as Jews. Yael or Jael killed an enemy by driving a spike through the temple. And this too is a very popular theme for artists. I love this one. It's just so decorous. She's very dainty. And this one is by Artemisia Gentileschi, one of the few famous women artists from Europe centuries ago. Another biblical heroine is Rahab the harlot. She's actually a prostitute. She's not Jewish, but through subterfuge, through cleverness, she aids the Jewish people. And she becomes a named ancestor of Jesus Christ. Think of that. A woman who's not Jewish, she's a professional prostitute, and she's named in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Another ancient culture that produced folklore that is significant to us today is the ancient Greeks. And what can I say? It was a Greek miracle, 2,000, approximately 500 years ago, give or take a couple centuries. The Greeks made amazing advances in architecture, in study of the natural world, in medicine, in mathematics, and in narrative. And if I had to name one folklore heroine who I loved above all others, it would be Antigone, a Greek figure. Her brother Polynices is left to rot. He's dead, and his body is left to rot out in the wilderness to be eaten by vultures and jackals because the king Creon says he doesn't deserve a funeral. Antigone defies Creon and goes out there to bury her brother. I just love her courage. And another ancient culture that produced narrative that is significant to us today is ancient India. And I'll say more about ancient India in a little bit. The thing about folklore is that folklore is infinite, virtually infinite. Every day, someone's telling another joke, telling another legend, producing a new variation on Cinderella. So anybody who talks about folklore is going to engage in this process of cherry picking, where you just pick something because you like it, not because of any rhyme or reason. And before I close, I'm going to do some cherry picking, and I'm going to talk about 14 women in folklore, some of them real people, some of them characters, who I think are worth mentioning. One of them is Zora Neale Hurston. If you're at all interested in voodoo, you really need to read her book, Mules and Men. She's also author of a remarkable book, Barracoon, that tells the story of a man who was kidnapped in Africa by woman warriors, no less, sold as a slave, and came to the United States on the last slave ship. And Zora Neale Hurston was alive in the 20s, and he was a very old man. And Zora Neale Hurston interviewed him, and she was inspired to do so by her mentor, Franz Boas, whom you see in the left-hand corner, the father of American anthropology. And she was funded by Charlotte Osgood Mason, a philanthropist who supported Zora Neale Hurston and other artists of the Harlem Renaissance. And the next woman in folklore I cannot not mention is Minerva, who was a voodoo priestess who lived and worked in the 20th century. And she is featured in the book Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, which is the best-selling nonfiction book ever on the pages of the New York Times best-selling books. And the book presents a very sympathetic and detailed portrait of a voodoo priestess and how she goes about doing her work. Another folkloric woman I must mention is Scheherazade. Scheherazade is a Persian, what we would call today Iran. The Shah didn't want any woman ever to betray him. So he would have sex with women and then kill them. And he had killed over 1,000 women. And Scheherazade very bravely volunteered to go to his bedchamber to be the next one. And she begins to tell him a story. And it's such an interesting story with such a cliffhanger that he lets her live another night. And she keeps doing that for 1,001 nights. And here's another image of Scheherazade. Let's go to pre-Columbian Mexico, the Aztec culture. The Aztec culture really offers a challenge to anyone who believes in cultural relativism because it is so bloody and so brutal. This is their god of death, and he's standing in front of a wall of skulls. And where did they get these skulls? They got these skulls by sacrificing human beings. They raided neighboring tribes, took back hostages, and killed them, and sometimes mounted their skulls on these walls of skulls. Now this is an Aztec princess who is recorded in the Chronicles, who took one lover after another, hundreds of lovers, and then killed them and made bodies out of their skin and their bones and decorated her palace with the bodies of her former lovers. And here's an image of the princess with her former lovers. And this image is so weird to me because whoever made the image gave her like European features and a European body type, but dressed her in Aztec finery, kind of schizophrenic. And here is Coatlicue, an Aztec goddess. She's the Aztec earth goddess. And again, I offer this image to anyone who says, oh, if we worship goddesses, we'd all love the earth and we'd love each other, we'd live in peace. Yeah, I don't think so. Coatlicue, as you can see, it looks as if her head is made of snakes, but that's not her head. Coatlicue has been decapitated by her own children, and the snakes are emerging from the stump where her head used to be. And as you can see, Coatlicue is wearing a necklace of human hands and human hearts. Where did she get those hearts? From human sacrifice. The Aztec goal in sacrifice was to rip out a human heart while it was still beating. And according to the Chronicles, the Aztecs sacrificed as many as 80,000 people over the course of 4 days. Here's another figure from Central America, pre-Columbian Central America, but this is actually a real woman who really lived. She is called La Malinche, and her life story is so fascinating that it really needs to be a big budget Hollywood movie. La Malinche was an Indian woman. She was born to an Indian family. Her father died, and her widowed mother sold her into slavery. And the slavers who bought her were Maya, and they sold her again to somebody else. And she ended up being handed off so that she had to learn the language of all these different groups where she was being sold. And she also came in contact with a Spanish priest who had been, one of the early boats coming to the New World, and had been kidnapped by the Indians and sold into slavery as well. And so from this priest, she learned to speak Spanish. And so when Hernán Cortés made his way to pre-Columbian Central America, she became his translator. And as you can see in this picture, La Malinche is straddling the borders between two worlds. You've got the conquistadors on one side, and you've got the Aztecs on the other side. And she's the one in the middle doing the translating. And check out this picture. You can see that she's literally directing Cortez as Cortez is meeting with Moctezuma, the leader of the Aztecs. La Malinche is a very controversial figure. I would think that she would be a heroine for the people of Central America because she is like Native American and she's from Central America and she had a relationship with Cortez and she gave birth to his son Martin. And they say that that's like the first recorded birth of someone who is part European and part Native American. And a good portion of the population of Mexico is mixed in that way. But there are many people in Mexico who hate her because they see her as a traitor to her own people, because she went off with the conquistadors and she made peace with them and she guided them around the countryside and she translated for them. So many people don't like her and they regard her as a traitor. And as a matter of fact, there's a house in Mexico in which she lived, like it still stands, and it's very controversial. And also people attempted to erect a statue to her and it was torn down. And here's a TV show that was made about La Malinche. Now here's La Llorona, and I'm going to scroll past that because it's creepy. But La Llorona is a story that a woman killed her own children and threw them in the river. And so she hangs out near bodies of water and mourns and makes weeping noises. And if you go by there with your kids, she'll drown your kids as well. And some people relate this legend of La Llorona to La Malinche, and they tell it this way, that Cortez rejected La Malinche because he had a European wife, and that out of rage she threw their child Martin into the river. And that's actually not true, because she didn't throw her child Martin into the river. He grew up to be an adult and a successful man. But anyway, the legend is that you've got this weeping woman throwing children into bodies of water. Now here's Dia. Dia is another really fascinating figure who has something in common with La Malinche. Dia was a Berber North African warrior queen in the 7th century. And when the Muslim conquest emerged out of Arabia and exploded across North Africa, the Berber people were like the native people of North Africa. They had their own religion, they had their own language, many of them were Christian or Jewish. And when the Arabs moved across, they said, okay, you have to be Muslim now, and we're going to make war on you. And Dia, as a Berber woman, fought back. And she died in battle, or other people say she committed suicide, fighting back against the Muslim conquest. And today in North Africa, most people are Muslim, most people speak Arabic, and yet many people in North Africa regard Dia as a heroine, even though she represents the previous pre-Islamic conquest culture, and they regard her as a representative of Berber culture. All right, here's another folkloric woman worth mentioning. In modern day urban legends, women are in danger or women are dangerous. And this urban legend that there's a babysitter in the house and she keeps getting scary phone calls and she calls the police and they trace the call and they find out that the call is coming from inside the house. The babysitter is in danger. And in another urban legend, the woman is dangerous. She dates this man, she drugs him, and she steals his kidney. My favorite folktale heroine of all time is this girl. She is a shepherdess, and she's the heroine of a tale called King Wyvern. And King Wyvern is about a prince who is a dragon. And his parents keep trying to marry him off, and he takes the women to his bedchamber, and you know what I'm going to say next, he kills them, because he's a dragon, and that's what dragons do, right? And so this shepherd girl says, let me at him. And so the shepherd girl marries the prince who's a dragon, and she gets some advice on how to handle a husband who's a dragon. And she takes some milk, and she takes some vinegar, and she takes some birch rods, and she beats the crap out of them. I just love this story, don't you? And here she is getting ready for her wedding night with the king dragon. And here she is beating the crap out of this dragon. And after she beats the crap out of him, as you might imagine, he turns into a handsome prince. And there's another story from Japan, the Crescent Moon Bear. It's a lovely story about a Japanese woman who learns a valuable lesson through patience and through love. There's no violence in this story. It's all about getting what you want in life by being patient and loving. And here's another image of the Crescent Moon Bear. And here's an Indian story, the woman who turned herself into the flowering tree. Very sweet story, very generous story about a woman who can turn herself into a flowering tree, and she does so in order to help her family, and her generosity is noticed by a prince, and he marries her. And even though he's a wealthy prince, after they marry, he shares in her poverty. Like, he has to wander the countryside for a while as a poor person, which I find very poignant. And eventually, of course, they return to the palace, but there's that sort of mention that says, yeah, poor people matter too. And here again is the woman turning herself into a flowering tree. And it became an opera and a dance. And one last woman in folklore who is worth mentioning, this is a Hopi Tewa potter named Nampeo. When I used to work at the Phoebe Apperson Hearst Museum in Berkeley, California, I always used to pass a display case devoted to Nampeo. And I was really taken by the beauty of her designs. And she made some designs based on material that was unearthed by an archaeologist and preservationist of Native American culture, J. Walter Fuchs. And 4 generations of Nampeo's descendants are potters. And here are some pots created by Nampeo, or by her descendants, or by people inspired by Nampeo. Again, folklore is so vast that, I can only kind of, skim the surface. I recommend the book Many Ramayanas. One of the main stories of the Indian subcontinent is the Sita Rama story, the Ramayana. And women living in villages often retell the Ramayana story so that Sita becomes more important. Because the Ramayana is very much a male story. It's about Ram, and it's about this 10-headed demon, and it's about the monkey god who helps Ram. And these are all male, and Sita is just kind of a footnote. But women can retell the story in a way that makes Sita more central. One of my favorite collection of folktales is Speak Bird, Speak Again. It's Palestinian Arab folktales collected and retold by 2 men who are Muslims and Arabs themselves, and these stories are really fun to read, and the anthropological background gives you a really deep understanding of the culture that the stories come from. If you haven't got a copy of Edith Hamilton's Mythology, your life is incomplete, and you just have to get this book. I also recommend the Folklore Muse, because there's a piece by me in the Folklore Muse, the Ramayana as if Sita mattered. And I retell the Ramayana with Sita as the main character. And of course, I recommend my book, God Through Binoculars. And here are a couple of books by 2 huge scholars talking about how the Grimms manipulated their tales in order to manipulate images of women. Basically, the Grimms worked to make the tales more violent, more punitive, to make men more active, to make women more passive, and also often more guilty. And they lived happily ever after, and I thank you very much for accompanying me on this brief visit to the world of women in folklore.